welcome everyone to another episode of Fundamental Questions of Being. I'm very pleased today to have with me, or actually I'm with them at their church, Holy Family in Fond du Lac. I've got Father Edward with me and Father Ryan. We have just met today, and so first of all, thank you both for being with me.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
I appreciate you inviting me into your nice facility here and for giving your time to have this conversation.
Yeah, it's good to have you.
Yeah, so as I explained before we started rolling here to both of them, I currently do not belong to a church, and so this is neither to condone or condemn anyone else's beliefs, but just to have a discussion, gain some information, and gain as many different perspectives as possible. So today, I'm hoping to ask you guys, I start out with two questions, and they're real fundamental. One, and you can pick which one you'd like to start with. The first one is, what do you believe happens after death? And the other one is, what is life to you? And I'll try to leave it just as open as possible. You could answer that in a biological way or in a spiritual way or whatever way you feel inspired to talk about today. So, or if you've got a specific topic that is on your heart that you would like to get to, by all means, just let me know. But otherwise, which one of those sounds like the best starting off point? And by all means, feel free to give a little bit of an introduction of yourself to the people here.
Sure. You want to start out?
Sure. Well, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Father Edward Sanchez. I'm associate pastor here at Holy Family Parish, and I've been a priest for about a year and a half. So I'm committed. I'm in a faith. I'm Catholic. And I guess I would tackle the first question that you mentioned here, like what do you think happens when you die? And for me, there's like, when you die, there's a separation of the soul from the body. And what is the soul? Well, the soul is what makes you who you are, makes you what you are. And so I would say like my soul is like all those qualities that go into like my personality and my mind and my heart. The things that I love, the things that I hate, the things that I remember, those are all the characteristics and the aspects of my soul. And there's something about that I think, at least, and I think a lot of people sense this, something about that is enduring. Something about that is, if we could say, like, spiritual. Maybe even as a Catholic, I'd say it's even eternal. And that there's something in that reflects the God on the other side who's creating all of this, who's created this reality that we live in. And so what I believe is when you die, that's the separation of that soul, that image of God, that divine spark from the body. And so at that point, your soul goes before the one who made it, goes before the God who created it. And he basically reflects to the soul what it is, reflects to that soul, like, who are you? Have you done well? Have you, like, given yourself in a real way in this life? And based on that, the soul is either welcomed into the presence of God, the place where he is, or goes through some period of purification to reach that presence, or goes into the place of separation from God based on kind of what it wants. That's kind of that's definitely how I would try to answer in kind of broad and I think understandable terms.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a couple questions just from all that.
But I want to first
go ahead.
I mean, we might want to answer a couple of those.
Yeah.
All that I would maybe add to that is, those philosophical questions that we all kind of struggle with about being and existence and all of that. I think we kind of see the summation of that kind of all tied up in the human soul, that natural expression of being in the human soul, and so and how Father Edward talked a little bit about how that whole human being is kind of tied up in that, all that we are and becoming. And so we kind of see kind of where love plays a very important role in all of that, and why that scripture speaks of that so eloquently about the enduring qualities that exist not only in the human soul but in God who created all of us. So
Yeah, I like your definition of soul. And I like how you added on that we're all faced with those questions. They're just inherent in being, and no one is given is told exactly this is what's what, this is what's what. We're given clues, and there's even debate over the clues, you know. And so a couple of questions that came up for me is, what would be, you talked about, first of all, that we will be facing our Creator and the one that we were made in the image of, the divine spark. I like that expression a lot, divine spark. What in your mind is the, it's sort of a courtroom scenario. What are the criteria for judgment? How does one find themselves, if they want to be, staying in communion with God forever? That's the question.
How does one maintain communion with God?
Yeah. How does one, in the afterlife, you talked about there's like 3 levels, and that's something that I have heard recently. I hadn't, it was only recently that I had heard about kind of 3 different words for hell used in the Bible in the original languages, like Sheol and Gehenna. Mm-hmm. And I've been very fascinated by that. That's something that, coming from where I came from, I didn't know too much about, but I'm intrigued by that, and so that there could be different outcomes for different people, and so that's where I'm trying to kind of get an understanding what would be the criteria that someone might go into, like a holding place, or I think you said purification, mm-hmm. or where someone would be able to avoid that and be in direct communion with God in the afterlife.
I mean, I guess if we look at heaven as being this place of perfection, right? Mm-hmm. This time with God, this eternity with God, rather, we need to have some sort of an understanding that our life here on earth has been lived out imperfectly, mm-hmm. right? And so this continuation of the soul, this union with God, needs to have some time of purification, right? Now, we know that that God is not subject to time. He's not subject to space. He's beyond all of that, right? But we use it in our terms so that we can gain a better understanding of what time looks like, right? Or how we understand it as human beings. But the soul, in our Catholic tradition, we definitely believe needs to go through a period of cleansing, right? A period of purification, and we use the term purgatory, right? Purgation or cleansing to describe that time of preparation for the soul to return to God.
Yeah. Why is that necessary?
So I think it's C.S. Lewis who gave this analogy. He was like, imagine, and it's very scriptural. Imagine if you were invited to a banquet or to a wedding dinner, and you got there, and you discovered that you were kind of covered with dirt, and you had salt stains on your pants, and you were sweaty, stuff like this. You got there, you're like, oh, well, here's this place. It's meant to be this place of beauty and perfection, like Father Ryan said, but I am kind of like not in that place myself. He said you would really welcome the opportunity to go and shower quickly before you went into the place of perfection and communion, right? And so for him, purgatory was that kind of experience, that kind of time of cleansing. And I think here's really what it is, mm-hmm. is you can be a basically good person, but still have like your loves out of order. Like you can still be basically a good person, but still be attached to certain resentments, and be attached to certain angers or hurts from the past. And like you can't be going before God and hanging on to those. I mean, the presence of God will just kind of burn those away. That's another way of thinking about the purgation. It's like the presence of God burning away the things in you that you were attached to, whether resentments, pains of the past, disordered affections, anything like that. Burning those kind of things. Does that make sense?
So then at the end, nothing is left.
There's nothing but you and,
There's nothing left but you and God.
Yeah. And what is God? God is this exchange of love. The Father speaking to his Son in this, exchange of love with the Holy Spirit. The heaven is this encounter with this dynamic thing, which we can't even describe. But it's this exchange as the Father is speaking his word, the Son, into existence, and then loving that word in this gift of his love, of his Spirit to the Son. So if you're not like totally given into living that kind of way of speaking the truth and of loving the truth, and all of us are kind of on some sort of spectrum with regards to that. If you're not totally given to that, then you have some distance to make up to really enter into that kind of way of living.
Yeah, so there's a trail of thought that I've been down with regard to free will when it comes to kind of what we're talking about here, that it seems relevant, and see what you think about this. So I've been thinking a lot about in Genesis how things went down, and how use the words perfect and orderly. So God makes this perfect orderly creation. Everything's leading up to when he puts the crown of his creation into that perfect orderly creation, and then he allows for them to be tempted. And he doesn't put up with much, he doesn't put up with really anything. It's not like said, okay, well, you shouldn't have done that, and then gives them a pass, and then a couple more. It's like, no, one time, boom, done. And that's been very interesting to me. It's like, whoa, okay, that's very severe. I'm a father, and I try to discipline my children in love and be firm when I need to be, and it's hard to gauge that sometimes. So to see such a strong reaction from their first sin, and so that kind of drives your point home of we cannot be in that communion. And I've been thinking about how painful it is to go through sin, like even if I was perfect like Jesus. Well, what happened to Jesus, even though he was perfectly loving to everyone and told the truth to everyone? We weren't murdered him anyway, So even if you're doing everything right, you're still subject to the free will of others. And I think that, God knew that possibly. And so it's like, I don't want to live with pain for the rest of my life. I'd like to have all good days. And so it's like, how do you get to all good days when everyone has their own free will? And so I've been thinking more about, like, this is a time of grace where we are allowed to live in sin, where Satan's allowed to rule, so to speak, and that it's when we sin and run away, like the prodigal son, we feel the weight of the law, and that pulls us back like the prodigal son. And then it's, to me, a combination of that law burning in our hearts and feeling inadequate compared to Christ, and then the combination of that with the gospel that could possibly be what confirms us in our holiness. You talk about purification. I've come to think of this life as basically walking through the fire. Like we're subject to everybody else's free will, and our own sin, and being subject to other people's sin is basically that purification, so to speak, and God just lets us live. It's like Adam and Eve, it's like they made their bed and he says, you can lie in it now. And the only way back to me is through the door, through Christ.
Yeah. And I think that's why, we'll oftentimes call Christ the new Adam, right? I mean, he is the one who came into the world to renew that. And as you were talking about Adam and Eve and God's kind of swift judgment of them, I couldn't help but think, like, I wonder why, though, that the swift judgment came, I think, because God created everything perfectly. Like, there were no other human beings on earth that experienced earth in all of its perfection, like Adam and Eve did. Right. They had everything. They had everything they could possibly need. And
even to know what it feels like just to not have any sort of mental, physical, emotional pain.
They had none
whatsoever.
of it. They had none of it.
That bliss is incomprehensible.
Yeah. And not even just by themselves, but with another person.
Right.
I mean, imagine that.
The perfect companionship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yep. So I think, as Satan came onto the scene in Adam and Eve, and we see the fall of humankind at that point, I think that we're kind of subject to that, right? That state of original sin that exists now in the world because of that fall. And we're called to struggle with that, to turmoil, and to figure out a path towards Christ, right? And so, certainly in our tradition, we see the sacraments for us as being that way in which we are able to grow in our faith, to deepen our faith, to get us closer to Christ, to find that avenue. And for us, there's 7 of them, right? They allow us to kind of spread out a little bit and to say, okay, I need these things in my life so that I can become more Christ-like. And
I'm not
unless
familiar with that, by the way. We only have 2 where I come from.
All right, yeah. So maybe Edward wants to talk a little bit about
the sacraments.
The sacraments.
Sure.
Yeah, well, so there's 7 sacraments, and they kind of extend. They share with us the life of Christ, like his life, his way of living in grace. So they kind of parallel human life in a certain sense, where you have some at the beginning and some kind of at the end. You have baptism, confirmation, and Holy Communion, Holy Eucharist are there at the beginning, and then you receive confession. Is this like reconciliation with God? When we sin, we turn against Him, like Adam and Eve. He invites us in now through Christ in this like immediate invitation of reconciliation with Him. So that's the sacrament of confession. And there's 3 more. The first 2 have to do with like your way of giving yourself in love. And there's 2 ways in the Catholic Church basically that people formally do that, and they are through through the priesthood, and then through marriage, right? So in marriage is a sacrament because it's a sign that makes present the love of Christ. So as Paul says, it's the love of Christ for the church. And so marriage is a symbol of that, but that God is actually blessed, as Christ, when he was there at the wedding feast of Cana, kind of blesses this marriage and makes it not just a symbol, but an efficacious symbol. It shares that grace, that faith, that life.
It's hard to find a better explanation than the old Baltimore Catechism one, right? We've got a catechism which is kind of summation of our church's teachings, and they always defined a sacrament as an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace, and I think that you kind of
sums it all up.
It does, yeah.
It's funny you say that, the outward sign to show the grace. I was thinking about so Holy Communion and baptism, and how we use water with baptism, because tying in with that idea of that we're sort of born into the fire here, and hell is associated with fire and Satan's rule there, and how that water, when we come into God's family, quenches that fire, puts that out, and invigorates us, refreshes us, and gives us new life. And then with Holy Communion, just an idea that I've been thinking about is when we take and eat the body of Christ, that it reminds us that we're a part of his family, and that he made all of us and wants us all equally with him, and that all of the people that he's made makes up his body of work, and wants us to be his hands and feet and help call those others who might be on the fringes back in. And one point that I wanted to get back to before, with regard to
can I just ask you a question? I mean, you described this in a beautiful way, like us receiving Holy Communion and becoming that way, like more part of the body of Christ in his hands and feet. Like, I don't know, that sounds really Christian to me. It sounds really like you would be in a church, I guess, just from that way of thinking.
I was raised in a church.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and so I also have
so
family
that's
who are in the
like
ministry.
A nice thing out there that you don't really believe anymore, like for yourself, or?
No, I believe that. I just this is a good question, because there's religion, there's organizations of institutions of people who come together and say we believe the same things and we're going to worship together. And then there's, the term spirituality, or people's just walk of asking the questions that are inherent with all of us. And, with religions, it's, let me put it this way. This is another thing I've thought about lately is, so with Adam and Eve, originally there was just like basically the one church is the Church of Christ, as they were waiting for Christ to come, and that was their faith. That's where they put their hope. And at some point, that wasn't the case anymore. There started to be splits and different denominations and churches, and that's just been fragmenting since then. And even if you look at like the Lutheran Reformation and the Protestant explosion that came from that, and all the fragments that came from there, so we've been consistently fragmenting since the beginning, and everybody's been trying to figure out what exactly is the truth. And So I felt myself, for personal reasons, that it was God willing for me to leave the church that I was at. And I'm still in talks with the leadership there. But so I just find myself in kind of this weird limbo place.
Yeah,
And
sure, yeah.
and that's where, we're called to be his witnesses and to go out into all the earth.
Right.
And so that was kind of my hope, to try and do that anyway.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really change my walk too much, except it would be nice to have a home place to go and worship with and identify with that set of beliefs.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, Catholicism, I mean, we make the bold claim that we have the fullness of truth, within the faith that we profess in Jesus Christ. And I think that's can never be underestimated or taken lightly, and I think
Right.
we as priests take that very seriously, and it doesn't discount, I guess, the important work that we do in terms of interreligious dialogue and collaboration with other faith communities, but that that desire for oneness, that desire for unity that we see at the very beginning of the church is crucial to the well-being of Christianity and to the survival of the faith around the world.
right. You want to stand on the rock, and you want to be confident that you are standing on the rock. And so it's good to constantly be asking yourself that. And I think, we're warned of false prophets and people just having misunderstandings. And so that's another reason why you always want to be on guard. God's word says to be on guard. And so I think there's no better way to get to the truth than by talking with people that I've grown up with and who have believed the same things as me. But it's like, what if I was born into a completely different faith that was not even remotely Christian whatsoever? How do I find my way from there, And so that's how we do it, is to talk to each other.
Right.
So,
Right.
one question that I really wanted to go back to is, it was interesting, we were talking about, you said you kind of just have to face that, essentially your free will, the opportunity to choose evil. That's another idea that I've been exploring. The Israelites, when they were brought out of slavery in Egypt, and they were bitten by venomous snakes. And then Moses puts the bronze snake on the staff and says, you got to look at that. I always found that's really interesting to me, is they have to look at the thing that was attacking them. And then in Job, when Job's at his wit's end, and you expect God to kind of come in and comfort him, he's like, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, and have you seen the storehouses of snow? And then he goes on this long rant about a beast called Leviathan, this like snake-like, dragon-like creature. And so it's like he has to face that in his darkest moment, and then we have to look to Christ on the cross, where our evil, the evil of the world, ultimately murdered the Christ that came to save us. So we chose to use our free will to kill our God and trap ourselves in hell, essentially. And I've found that all so interesting lately. It's like we have to face the beast, this constant threat of evil that's always like kind of tied to us, and gain that maturity, it seems. That's where I'm at right now, currently with my walk, is it seems like this life is basically like training wheels to learn how to use this technology of free will that our loving Father gave us.
Yeah, I think that's
Does
pretty much
that Does that sound okay to you?
yeah. Like an adventure, like The Hobbit. Did you ever read The Hobbit?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, Bilbo starts out as this kind of bumbling guy. He's like, I don't have enough handkerchiefs or whatever.
Yeah.
And at the end, he's like, actually, I mean, they say he's a burglar. He's for real. But he has to kind of become a burglar, which is kind of like this image of an adventurer, of this vision of someone who is free, actually.
The adventurer. So Abraham was told to go on an adventure. He was pretty set up, and God says, go.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you where, but just go. Have an adventure,
Yeah.
I think that's interesting too. I've been thinking about the Mario effect. There's a popular YouTuber called Mark Rober. He used to work for NASA. He makes interesting scientific videos, but he talks about the Mario effect, Where if you had a video game and your guy just, the point was to go straight across the level and boom, you're done. Beep, boop. Like, that would be the most boring game ever and no one would buy it. Mm-hmm. You would want one where he has to go up like mountains and dips and valleys and like have to fight alligators or whatever. Like, that's the game people would be interested in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this life, it's like we're subject to everybody's free will, but their opportunities, their challenges, their experiences, and their ways that God is showing himself to us and his grace and
there's
his love.
beauty in all of it, right? I mean, there's beauty and grace in all of it. That's part of the excitement of living this life, right? Is that we're constantly striving to choose holiness, to choose to grow, to be a better person, to be more whole person, right? And so, we have that path that we desire to walk on, and part of the adventure is walking it, right?
And the drama of the fact that sometimes we don't choose it. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
Or that you don't have to, right? That
Right.
you could, and we look in our past and we're all like, oh yeah, in the past.
Yeah, when you think of all good film, all good movies have that adventure in it, or that adventure that has its roots in the depths of our hearts, and that's what makes good films good, right? Is that adventure,
Right. The arc.
Yeah, and that Christ-like figure in there too, that laying down of oneself for the sake of another.
Yeah. How you doing? Are we okay on time yet?
Yeah,
okay.
We're great.
One of the so going back to how does one get there? How does one find themselves in? Because I guess what I'm getting at is, for instance, Luther had a issue back then with buying forgiveness, and but then he also had an issue with people calling themselves Lutherans, which is something I've thought about recently.
Sure.
I would name myself after Christ, but that is an interesting thing. It's like, what can I do for God? And ultimately, all of our punishment is laid on Christ on the cross. So that's what would you say is the Catholic stance as far as is there anything that we can do to get to heaven? Is that the right mindset? Am I even asking the right question? Or is it, there's the debate over like faith alone, scripture alone, all of that stuff. We're kind of delving into that world. What would you say? I don't even know if I'm asking a direct question there, but.
I think maybe Edward can talk about the faith alone, scripture type of deal, but I don't think, I'll touch a little bit on the Reformation. I don't think you'd find a Catholic in the world that wouldn't say at some point that the need for reform in the church at that time was necessary. The question of how one should have went about that is probably a good question that we should ask and delve into a little bit, but I think that a reform from within is always good, a reform that is from without, that creates division and disunity within the body of Christ, is probably not what we would want. And so we would say, yeah, certainly, like Luther had legitimate gripes within the church, and there were things that were going on in a real human way that were probably not what should have been taking place. So, but then to build on that, I think is where we could kind of have a further discussion.
Yeah, you mentioned in the beginning, like the explosion after Luther of all these different disintegrating denominations. This kind of, I read a phrase like this hideous fecundity of denominations, as everyone gets to interpret the scriptures like in the way that they personally think, and they're like, well, my son doesn't think exactly the same way, and then someone else comes in, they form their own denomination. So it's not, that's not what Christ prayed for in John's Gospel at the Last Supper. He prayed that they might be one. Yeah. When God called Abraham out, right? He called him, and then he said, we're going to form a people. I'll make of you a great nation. So that unity is definitely part of God's plan. And we've really lost a lot of that.
I would agree with that, and that goes back to what we were talking about with marriage, because I've been, the vision of marriage for this life is, I think about it says in the Bible that in the afterlife we won't necessarily be given into marriage. And so I've been, thinking like in this life, one of the things that marriage shows us is just how hard it is to stay committed to someone. I define love personally as not like a feeling, but a decision that you are saying, I'm committed to you in the good times when I'm feeling it, but even in the bad times when I'm not feeling it. And Christ does bind himself to the church, his bride, in that way.
Yeah.
And then tells us to do that and model that. And it's hard to do. When you got two people who have their own free will and are living in an imperfect world. And so that kind of gets to this point of like, we were talking about we want to stand for truth.
Yeah.
And so it's at what point do you sever the tie and say we have to go our separate ways here? And you said the thing about it's good that everyone can access the scriptures, but it's also good for us to all talk about them and come together. And throughout the Christian church, there's been councils where they've what's the divinity of Christ? Let's get down and let's really nail this down here and talk about this and come together on this. And so it's sad to see when those break down and it doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, and I think councils, that's a great place for that renewal to take place, because again, it brings me back to my original point of that taking place within the church, so I think councils hopefully help to define, address, and kind of ratify or firm up a lot of those things that which is being discussed within the church itself. But I loved your thoughts on marriage, because it is tough. Married life is a challenge for people, and but it's that sacramental challenge. And I'll often joke with couples that I work with, and it's not joking, but I'll say, for a husband, it's your responsibility to work with your wife to get her to heaven, and the same goes for the wife, right? It's her responsibility to work to get her husband to heaven. And so you're constantly calling holiness out of each other through that vocation. Now, maybe one spouse feels that their work is a little more burdensome than the other, and that always could be the case. But nonetheless, it's a mutual call to holiness within that sacrament and that bond that exists in the marriage covenant, that bond that connects you to God as well.
Okay. Yeah.
So for a Catholic, I think you find salvation by entering into that bond, by becoming part of the bride. And you said like Christ is like always united to his church, laying down his life for the church, like the husband lays down his life for the bride. And how does he do that today? Like, is he still doing that? How is he doing it? So I would say he is still doing that, and he's doing that through the sacraments, through baptism. So I just baptized a child like an hour ago. It was awesome, right?
Yeah.
And everyone's like, "Oh, how cute! Very nice, very nice." Right? But like I'm on the inside, I'm like, "No, this is really. This is God. This is Christ giving His life to this child, to little, Sophia Ann. Like she's entering into this church, entering into this bride that Christ is loving and that He's sharing His life with. And so each of those sacraments, of these ways that Christ shares His life with His bride, the church, is by entering into the bride, the church, that we receive the life of Christ, this life which is that grace and that love, which if we allow to truly grow in us, when we stand before the Father, He'll recognize in us not just our own human life, but the life of Christ.
I think we even say dying to Christ, right?
Sure.
We dying with Christ or dying into Christ, because when you look at
exactly
when you come to Holy Family and you see our baptismal font, you have one side where you can walk down in, and so we do this at the Easter Vigil. You walk down into the baptismal font, you're baptized, and then you merge on the other side, and it's a great symbolism of us dying to self and putting on Christ, and then coming out of those waters of baptism, that moment of healing, again, that purification in the waters of baptism. But I think that death to self is so evident in all of the sacraments, including marriage. We often talk about free, faithful, and fruitful marriages. That's what we really look for in that sacrament, that the couple is freely choosing to enter into that marriage, that it is that they are committed to that faithfulness, and that marriage is going to be fruitful, that they're going to not only bear love for each other, but also through that expression of love, they're going to bring children or offspring into the world.
I have like 3 different directions that I want to go in. So I'm trying to pick which one I want to focus on. I think I want to go back to, there's one question that I really want to get to today, and if we run out of time, that's fine. Maybe we can get to another time. But so I've been thinking a lot about the source of truth. So in the beginning, God was the Word that spoke us into life, and the breath that breathed life into us. And I believe that Jesus was that Word in the beginning, and became the Word made flesh when he gave himself on the cross. But so God spoke his word to us, and men of God wrote that down at some point. They were speaking it to each other for some time, and then Moses wrote it all down in the book of Moses, and then from there more and more is added on. And one of the really interesting things that I've been trying to figure out is, so in Revelation it says, don't add or subtract more to the book. The book's done. So what are your thoughts on that? And then, but the thing that's been really interesting to me is during, again, the Reformation time, that there was a change in the book, that there was some books were decided to be taken out, and then that was called the Apocrypha. And so I don't have really any familiarity. I'm just starting to dip my toes into those books. But it seems like there's several doctrines or beliefs that stem from possibly those books. And so it's like, how do you, if you're trying to define the truth and what is the sacred scriptures that we're going to use here? So that's what I've been digging into, is the history of the book itself, the scriptures themselves, and how they came to be, and why there's some debate over those books as opposed to what's considered canon in one church against another. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah. So my understanding is this, that when Jesus and his contemporaries, they spoke in everyday language, they spoke Aramaic and probably Greek. They probably didn't speak Hebrew. And so when they read the scriptures, they probably read them and spoke about them in their Greek translation, which is a Septuagint. Maybe you're familiar with that. And that Septuagint, is these sacred books translated by the scribes and stuff like this, supposedly in Alexandria. That includes, all the books that the Catholic Church currently includes in the Old Testament. And so when the church kind of entered into after Christ, she took on those books as part of their holy canon. Why? Well, because Jesus and the apostles used them as well. Now, so they kind of kept going, and that lasted during a time of substantial unity in the church from about, 50 AD until about 1531 AD, 1517 AD. And around that time, Martin Luther and that group decided to go back and find only the books that were kind of originally written, or they had copies of, in Hebrew. And they kind of went back to this council that was supposed to have happened around in the second half of the 1st century AD, the Council of Jamnia, where supposedly the rabbis got together and they cleared out the ones that were from the Septuagint that were originally in Greek and found only the ones that were in Hebrew. And they're like, hey, look, the scribes and the Pharisees and the rabbis, they got rid of those Greek books. We should too. And so they got rid of those ones, which conveniently were the ones that had to do with purgatory, praying for the dead and stuff in Maccabees.
Right.
All that stuff.
Right.
So
that's the kind of stuff I'm really interested in right now.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's really good reason to believe now that the Council of Jamnia didn't actually happen. There's really good reason to believe that there were Hebrew copies of some of the books that were in the Septuagint that we only had Greek copies of until recently.
Interesting.
And even on a deeper note, the question has to be asked, the New Testament, who gets to decide which books are in the New Testament, and who has the authority to talk about that. If you go back, you would say, well, those books were the ones that were read in the Eucharist, in the Mass, in the in the liturgy. But the church kind of, first of all, created these books, right? And second of all, was the place that discerned which books, why Matthew's gospel and not Thomas's, for example, right? Like, it's not obvious. There's no divinely revealed table of contents.
One thing that I've heard is the consistency between topics talked about in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, and that's one of the differentiators. I wish I knew some of the other things that I've heard of as reasons that were given and why some were not and some were. But I know that was one of them. Mm-hmm. Whether or not Jesus talked about it, I think, was another one that had to do with like the Apocrypha and some of the books in there. But that was interesting because I had heard that the Book of Enoch, that he possibly did quote a section from the Book of Enoch, even though that's considered part of the Apocrypha. So, yeah, that's all stuff I'm interested in.
I think when you talk about, though, the establishment of that canon at the council, there was criteria that was used at that time to discern what books were to be included. So the historicity, the accuracy, the content within those,
right,
to create that canon. So that discernment was already done.
You're saying before it was taken out.
Right.
Yeah.
From the very first council that helped to, or not the first council, but the council, that helped to establish that canon.
I guess that's what struck me as so strange is this was said to be the book, and now we're saying this isn't the book anymore. Mm-hmm. So there better be I want to know exactly why. You know? Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it's strange for you, it's strange for us too. So
yeah.
Okay. It can't be something that was done lightly. That also doesn't mean that it was done correctly.
Is that your reminder, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. That's fine.
Yeah.
We might need to do a part 2.
Sounds good.
This,
well, that'll give us some time to think about what we talked about, and we can come back and revisit some of it.
Yeah.
I want to thank you both very much for your time.
Thank you, David.
Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, if you wanted to give your listeners a cliffhanger, what would be some of the topics you'd want to cover next time?
Well, I guess some of them, there are some pretty major themes from those books that I'm foreign to at the moment. Mm-hmm. Things like purgatory. I'd like to dig into more of the, the different definitions or names for hell and kind of go back to that a little bit and your thoughts there. Let's see. And then I don't know if we ever actually did completely answer the question of, maybe we did. It was kind of through the sacraments and joining the bride of the church. So yeah, I think you did answer that question. So it'd be the 2 cliffhangers, and then we could dig into the first question of what is life. We kind of started from death and worked our way backwards. So
right. Yeah, and I think the question of sola scriptura would be a good one to venture into as well.
I was trying to get there through asking about the book and how we got there, and build off from there. So yeah, that'll be a good starting point for next time.
Oh, let's go. That sounds good.
It was great meeting you both.
Thanks
again, and
thanks for having this podcast. The ultimate questions, entering into it.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah, might as well dig right into it. We're all thinking about it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, take care until next time. Thanks again.
Thanks
Thanks everyone.